Hello and welcome to the 8th in our series of asynchronous virtual roundtables on the impact of COVID-19 on transportation, logistics, and supply chain networks. I'm Hani Mahmasani, Director of the Northwestern University Transportation Center, and I will be your moderator. An asynchronous virtual roundtable is one where the interviews have taken place at different times and have been integrated into a single roundtable. At the end of the interviews, we will have a live Q&A session, so please ask your questions using the Q&A feature of Zoom. Today's focus is on rail operations, particularly freight rail operations. We'll be talking to Dave Arganbright, who's Vice President of Government Affairs for OmniTRAX, one of North America's largest private railroad and transportation management companies. Then we will speak to Eric Marchetto, who is Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at Trinity Industries. And third, we will speak to John Friedman, Vice President for Network Planning and Optimization at Norfolk Southern Corporation. And with that, we'll move to our first panelist. So Dave, you're a railroad career professional with over 30 years of experience, and you currently serve as the Vice President for Government Affairs for OmniTRAX, one of North America's largest private railroad and transportation management companies. I know you primarily provide first mile, last mile connections to suppliers, manufacturers, and in your role, you're responsible for creating public-private partnerships, in addition to representing the company on political and legislative matters. So you have extensive experience in this business, and you've certainly seen various, ups and downs in this industry and crises and so on. But how would you characterize the current disruption, and how different is it from previous crises that we haven't all experienced? And what are you seeing about economic activity and freight movement from your vantage point? Some carriers have not quite seen a major reduction. Others have seen surges, in fact. And so from your standpoint, how much of a reduction, I would say, in activity or increase are you experiencing relative to the same time last year?
Sure. Well, let me say first and foremost, this is a disruption unlike any we've ever faced in the railroad industry. The railroad industry, as you know, has historically been very resilient when significant changes in the economy occur, either positive or negative. Mm-hmm. But in this particular instance, our first priority has absolutely been on the health and welfare of our employees, primarily because we've never seen a situation that has personally and directly impacted railroad employees like today. Mm-hmm. Now, having said that, one of the hallmarks of railroad efficiency historically is that railroads are generally a leading indicator of the economy. When we see carloads slowing down, we know the economy is about to slow down. However, in this particular case, there was no indication that any slowdown in the economy was occurring. In fact, the only business that was off, not surprisingly, was oil and gas, but that was due to the Saudi-Russian oil price war, not due to any other economic factors. Mm-hmm. Historically, when we see reductions in business, railroads are very good at reducing their cost structure dollar for dollar with losses in revenue. We have not had to do that during this crisis. In fact, our business has remained strong, and we are continuing to work with our customers every day to continue to move as much, and in some cases more, product than we were working on before the crisis occurred.
Well, actually, the Saudi-Russian oil price war is in part due to the reduction in demand in China. So that in a way, it is related to this pandemic question. So, there's so I guess it's good to hear that you're not seeing at this point the kind of reduction that, let's say, the ocean carrying industry, for instance, has been experiencing. Within kind of the sectors that that you serve, have you seen kind of some where perhaps that may be surging versus others where there is more of a slowdown? For instance, in things related to chemicals and household cleaning products, for instance, or packaged food products and the like.
Sure. As you might expect, the railroads are primarily carriers of bulk commodities, work in process, raw materials, and those commodities that are contributing to the vitality of the current economy are in fact booming. Surprisingly, alcohol consumption and movement is way up. All kinds of foodstuffs and grains are continuing to move to market. Paper industry is very strong, particularly toilet paper. We serve a number of plants that manufacture soft tissue products. Those businesses are continuing very strong.
So you mentioned, of course, the health of employees, and are you doing things differently in terms of day-to-day operations, specifically because of health concerns for your employees, port partners, logistics hub partners, and customers?
We absolutely are, Hani. We were an early adopter as a company of the CDC's full guidelines and recommendations regarding both sanitary conditions, social distancing, and other things to protect our employees and their coworkers. And might I add that due to the volatile shift nature of the railroading business, many of our employees, and I suspect others in the industry as well, have spouses with similar jobs, which typically mean they're in the healthcare field. So our employees and their families are particularly at risk during this intervention. I am happy to report that all of OmniTRAX and its 20 railroads are currently operating as normal. None of our employees and none of their spouses have tested positive for COVID yet. And we continue to do what we can to ensure they're not put in harm's way.
That's awesome to hear. So Dave, stepping back from only the actual I guess goods that your companies are moving, where do you see the most critical vulnerabilities in our existing supply chains? Are you concerned more about nodes, warehouses, again, logistics hubs shutting down because of contamination concerns, labor getting sick, or more issues with providing capacity for the loads that shippers want to move?
Sure. I mean, as a short line railroad, it's pretty easy for us to sequester ourselves. We don't have to have a large gathering of people to do our jobs. However, a number of the industries we serve do. Warehousing and other things, for example, that by necessity require people to come together. To the extent that they might become eventually impacted, then that will flow through the supply chain, and it might have an impact on our ability to serve them. But in the meantime, we talk to our Class 1 partners and our customers daily, and we make sure that we're tailoring the type of service that they can use, particularly during this time, whether it's extra switches in a day or a week, or perhaps coming at a different time when the employees might not be there by the loading dock. Whatever works to keep the economy moving with a minimization of disruption.
So would you say that there's kind of more communication going on with your customers, shippers, other logistics providers, such as trucking companies and so on, in times like these? And how important is it really to maintain communication channels open with other participants in the supply chain?
In good times, there's always a healthy tension between customers and carriers and other potential industries that could carry our product in lieu of the railroad. But what we found today is there's a recognition that we're really all in this together. And the only way we're going to get through it is to collaborate as much as possible, make sure each of us have the information we need to take action. And it seems to have worked so far.
So you say that it is like, would it be fair to say then that there is more crisis motivated, I guess, collaboration potentially with competitors as well?
Yes, and more openness and transparency as a result.
That's good. So how do the services provided by OmniTRAX and I guess short lines in general contribute to making your shippers' supply chains more resilient?
That's a good question. I think if you think for a moment about the role that the short line industry plays, we are, as you identified, sort of the first mile, last mile entrance and exit to the supply chain. That means that we do the hunter-gathering work that a lot of the class ones no longer want to perform. They enjoy moving long trains great distances, and they prefer to let other entities like us do the dirty work. But in doing that dirty work, we have to maintain a close contact with our customers to see what we need to do to make their supply chain work. Some customers are okay with only being serviced once a week. Some need twice a day. It's a part of their physical infrastructure and what their constraints are, and also what their pipeline looks like and their time to market needs.
So how long would you say the current situation can continue before your company or your customers experience serious economic and financial hardship? And I know there's already quite a bit of that going on, but how long sort of before the rubber band snaps?
Well, of course, we are committed to standing by our employees for as long as we possibly can. We have not laid anyone off. We were eligible for and did apply for an SBA salary continuance loan. We are using that as appropriate. The unknown here, and I think to your question, is we don't know when the economy will begin to recover and in what measures. Certain industries will obviously come back much quicker than others. Some of the downturns that we are seeing, which are a direct result of the coronavirus, is the raw material that goes into automotive production, for example. The manufacturers, if they're not making N95 masks, are certainly sitting on their inventory waiting for buyers, and they're not building new at the moment. So scrap steel and products like that are beginning to slow down. If the housing industry is forced to stop, that'll begin to stop the flow of lumber and other raw materials. So we haven't seen it yet, but I think, to your question, the longer this continues, the more of those industries may be impacted.
Well, this has been very informative, Dave. Do you have any final thoughts for us, and any takeaways that you'd like our audience to get today?
No, I think from your perspective and your role, Hani, it's very valuable, and we're very proud of the fact that as a member of the supply chain community, that we are able to be productive, remain in business, and continue to get the items that our economy and our people need the very most when they need it the very most. So I'm a big believer in the transport sector, as are you. And when times are tough is when we prove that it really works.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, and wish you all the best.
Thank you, Hani.
All right. Okay, so Eric, you're a Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at Trinity Industries with over 2.5 decades of leadership experience in the rail business. Previously, you were responsible for all Trinity Rail's commercial activities, secondary market activities, and customer and industry relationships. And you've played a key role in the development, growth, and evolution of the railcar manufacturing, leasing, and services businesses into the Trinity Rail integrated business model. You've seen ups and downs in the rail and freight business, but probably nothing like the present crisis. And unprecedented, I think everybody refers to it as being unprecedented. But it's been nearly 2 months now since social distancing orders were put into place. And with it, social and economic activities have dramatically changed. So have, I guess, freight flows. And so what are you seeing about economic activity and freight movement from your vantage point at this time? And how have rail operations changed over the last 4 to 6 weeks? And how is that impacting the rail car business?
Yeah, so it feels like 2 months of Tuesdays, doesn't it? With all the changes and working from home. First, let me just say that we're proud to be part of an essential industry in North America. Trinity is an essential industry. About 80% of our customers our estimate is that they were deemed essential. Nearly 30% of all freight movements moved by rail. And we've effectively moved the building blocks of modern life, from food to chemicals to construction materials. But we've certainly been impacted. Through April of this year, rail car traffic is down about 10% over the same time last year. But when you look at April is down about 25% year over year. And we expect that to kind of carry through in the second quarter. That's the biggest monthly decline on a year-over-year basis since the numbers were tracked beginning in 1989. And I can't think of it another time in our history where you've had that sudden stop that we had in the late first quarter into the second quarter. The declines in rail traffic, they did lag some of the other economic contraction. So we were a little later to get in as supply chains were still being refilled, and you were moving a lot of the available, ensuring necessities like food and paper products. And so prior to that, we were seeing some growth year over year in a lot of our industries. So it certainly has had an impact. With that much drop in rail demand in the second quarter, there's clearly slack in our North American rail supply chain. The way Trinity's reacted, we've reduced our manufacturing headcount by about 30% since the end of 2019. So pretty dramatic cuts in our production capacity, and likewise in the administrative costs side, we're also seeing some impacts there and having to take cost out of our platform.
So with commerce and international trade drastically impacted by COVID-19, as you mentioned, and also on top of that, I guess health issues that are forcing plant closures, temporary shutdowns for extended cleaning, and in some instances, you referred to some initial surge, I guess, would need to prioritize essential versus non-essential goods. What kind of impact are you picking up from the vantage point, specifically of the services that you provide your rail customers? Are they canceling orders? Are they scrambling to find more cars of certain type in certain markets while moving away, say, from AutoRacks?
We are certainly seeing a drop in demand with the 25% rail car less freight loadings that we're seeing in the second quarter. That has a corresponding impact on demand attributes. Well, it's not even, there's not one rail car market, there are markets of rail cars. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the auto rack business, the automotive business being, virtually shut down at the current point in time. There's certainly no demand for new equipment at that moment. Mm-hmm. There's 1.7 million rail cars operated in North America. And there's probably, by many estimates, about 25% of those are at least underutilized at this moment. So there's certainly a lot of slack in the industry right now.
Mm-hmm. So Trinity is, of course, a major player in tank cars, especially for crude oil and related products. How has COVID-19 impacted oil production and shipments within the U.S.? Of course, you've had the international drop in oil prices as well, compounding that. So how has Trinity and how have your customers' operations been impacted by that? And have these issues improved or worsened in the last several weeks?
Sure. So certainly crude by rail is a part of the market that we serve. Uh, Crude oil shipments were down about 20% in the month of April.
Mm-hmm.
But rail freight is not the most efficient mode of transportation for hydrocarbons.
Mm-hmm.
In general, pipelines are going to be a more preferred method to move those commodities. But sometimes rail does have a particular role, especially if there's an arbitrage opportunity where there's not pipelines.
Mm-hmm.
If there's certain dislocations in the supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned crude being down 20% in April. But it's a very small piece of overall shipments.
Yeah.
It's about 1% of all originations, but it does have an impact. And it's funny, you mentioned the tank car demand. It is, not unusual for people to equate tank cars with crude oil. And it's actually a lot of the refined products, more downstream products that move in the rail and the tank cars, mm-hmm. or other chemicals, petrochemical products, or also agricultural products that will move mm-hmm. by tank car. On the energy industry, specifically with the crude, where we've seen more of an impact is in the frac sand industry. Mm-hmm. Frac sand is one of the inputs for shale drilling. Yep. And that industry, that part of the market was already challenged because of in-basin sand. Yep. The in-basin sand moved more as a local truck move. Mm-hmm. The northern white sand is more of a rail move. That has certainly, with the stopping and drilling, that certainly has had an impact. And that's a customer base that we're watching very closely with their financial condition.
Mm-hmm. So what about agricultural products that typically, I guess, move west for to export to China and so on? Is that pretty much on halt as well?
No. So a lot of the rail industry is really moves a lot of the food industry within North America, and also you mentioned the export market. Mm-hmm. So in terms of, that's been the one bright spot that we're seeing in terms of that demand being holding up nicely. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the, not really the scope of this conversation, but when you think about the shelter in place, yep. More of our calories are in a box than they were probably 3 months ago.
That's right.
We've all changed our diets a lot, mm-hmm. and a lot of those flours, starches, mm-hmm. Generally move by rail. Yep. And so from that standpoint, we've seen that demand really steady. Now the export demand, not there as much, but on the refined agricultural products, we are seeing that demand hold up nicely.
So are you doing things differently in terms of day-to-day operations, specifically because of health concerns for your employees, rail partners, and customers? And I guess what have we learned as an industry in the last weeks through the maintenance services that you provide your rail customers?
So in our manufacturing environment, we're mm-hmm. certainly doing things differently. Social distancing and railcar manufacturing really weren't terms that went together. And so we've learned a lot. We've changed a lot of our practices. I'm really proud of the way the teams have faced these challenges. We've continued to operate our facilities throughout the COVID-19 crisis. We've had really no work stoppages as a result of any outbreaks, and we've been able to keep people safe. We've done that by a much more rigorous industrial cleaning process, staggering shifts, staggering breaks, a lot of all the best practices. We've really been following the lead what the CDC and the different experts talk about how to keep people safe. Mm-hmm. The surprising thing about it in this time is we've actually had better attendance rates. Early on we had People were a little fearful of coming to work, and they've seen the processes and the procedures that we put in place, and our attendance rates are actually much better than they were in our manufacturing facilities, and also our safety has improved tremendously. And I think it's just we're communicating with our employees much more on a daily basis around their health and around trying to remain safe. And that has really made, I think it made our employees more conscious of safety. So it's kind of it's a nice benefit in an otherwise very negative environment. On the office side, we've been working remote really since about St. Patrick's Day, I guess. And we've had to embrace technology like this in terms of more video calling. We were not a video calling enterprise. So we've done a lot more remote work and trying to use Teams or Skype or Zoom, any of the technologies that people use. Yeah. And that's been, it's been surprising how well we've adopted. Now I kind of turn my nose up when we have a phone call, if it's not a video conference. It's my new normal.
Is most of your manufacturing in Texas as well?
So our manufacturing facilities are scattered between the U.S. and Mexico. So we have on the tank car side, we have a large manufacturing facility in Longview, Texas. Okay. We also have 2 manufacturing facilities in Mexico, Monclova and Sabinas, Mexico. And then our maintenance facilities for more of the aftermarket services, maintenance and repair of rail cars are throughout the U.S., Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Georgia. We're actually building a new facility that's coming online in Iowa, and that'll come online later this year.
Great. So on a broader level, where do you see the most critical vulnerabilities in sort of our existing supply chains? And this is, beyond the immediate, I guess, railcar business. Are you concerned more about nodes, warehouses shutting down because, say, of contamination concerns, labor getting sick, or possibly issues at your rail maintenance centers impacting your rail customers? Or are you more concerned about sort of issues along links, possibly with lack of capacity, though it seems that that's not the case at this stage, though there may be some areas where some markets or some lanes where possibly it's difficult to find capacity. But
so I think when you step back and you think about rail transportation as a whole, at least North American rail transportation, it is a very efficient mode of transportation. When you compare it to other modes of transportation, it's probably a much safer from a social distancing standpoint, of less interactions. So I think there's an opportunity. Rail has lost modal share over the last couple of decades, and that's probably more, it's the lowest cost mode of land-based transportation. It's the most sustainable from a fuel efficiency and a greenhouse gas piece of land-based transportation, and yet it's lost share over that time period. And it's probably more of a service gap than anything. Some of the predictability of rail has not been perfect. I think this is an opportunity for the Class 1 railroads and other railroad partners to really use this as an opportunity to try and regain some of that share. The North America and the world really needs this North American rail transportation network. It's the envy of the world in terms of rail transportation. And in this era, I think there's an opportunity for us to reclaim some of that modal share that we've lost. Obviously, we got to close some of the service gaps that we've created, that other modes of transportation have outdistances there. But hopefully through some of the technology that exists today or that's coming online, the rail network will be able to increase the technology and therefore the service capabilities and the visibility of those rail shipments, in order to close that gap and reclaim some of the share.
Mhm. So you mentioned communication with your employees as a factor in improving safety overall. How about your customers? How do you work with your customers in times like these? And how important is it to maintain communication channels with your railroad partners and possibly their major shippers? And is there perhaps more crisis-motivated collaboration taking place, even with competitors?
So, first on the rail industry, so the way we serve the rail industry is really through that industrial shipper channel. The railroads have only own about 20% of the rail cars in North America. So they've really outsourced the rail car procurement to the industrial shipper and leasing company. That's where we're the manufacturer. We're also a leasing company, and that we fill that role by providing the rail equipment. It's been historically very much a relationship business and a face-to-face business. And so with travel restrictions, people working from home, we certainly cannot do the face-to-face interactions. So we have to use technology to have those conversations. In some aspects, people are a little bit more available to have conversations because we're all a little bit more focused on work and with less distractions than we had a few months ago. So from that standpoint, it opens up possibilities to have more in-depth conversations with our customers. But the first month or so, I think people were really adjusting to working remote. Just about all of our customers went to working remote at the same time we did. So there's certainly a transition there. Then you go through kind of the stress of working from home. And now I think things are settling in a little bit more. We're able to have more of those conversations. I think some of the services that we're trying to develop, principally centered around data and technology, will help provide more information to customers and be a value added. And those are some of the things that we're focused on. But that's a big piece. When you talk about collaboration with competitors, and if there's more of it, we've certainly had a little bit more of that regards to safety. From an industry standpoint, trying to keep, whether it's our employees or one of our competitors' employees, there's been more sharing best practices in terms of keeping people safe, working with governments, whether they're governments in the U.S. or state governments or in Mexico, making sure that we were deemed essential, and making sure that we're able to keep people safe. So from that standpoint, there's been a little bit more of that. I think the reality is we're all in it together now, and we have to work together to keep everybody safe.
What about at the sort of individual piece of equipment where, a customer may need a certain type of rail car for a shipment, but then your own equipment happens to be in other location. Maybe a competitor has the piece of equipment that you need. Is there that level of collaboration going on?
No, I can't say that. Really, on a fleet basis, there's not a lot of sharing of rail car equipment back and forth. Generally, like I said, we're moving. We generally are supplying rail cars to the industrial shippers. That's not unusual for an industrial shipper. An ag shipper may, if they're long on a particular car type, they may work with another either part of their supply chain, or they may from time to time work with some of their competitors to swap equipment if they need to. But that's generally unusual in our space. People are worried about product contamination and making sure their supply chain actually, they need to have the record of the whole, especially in the food industry and in the chemical industry. They want to have that cradle to grave knowledge of their products and which rail cars are in. So it doesn't foster the sharing that maybe other modes of transportation may have.
Okay, so how do Trinity Rail's railcar leasing and management capabilities and services contribute to making, on one hand, railroads more flexible, and in turn to making their shippers' supply chains more resilient?
So I think that's a great question. The goal of our platform is to help customers optimize the ownership and usage of railcar equipment. I mentioned earlier about data analytics. We've invested a lot in data analytics to understand fleet performance and utilization of the actual rail cars. We're piloting a number of technology platforms that would give customers more insight to the performance of their fleets and enhance their logistics, the logistic operations that include the railcar usage. So we think about technology or innovation in several different ways. One being product technology. Our products haul commodities, but we don't want our products to be commodities. And so one of the things in products we want to differentiate and really come up with differentiated products that create value. You mentioned auto racks earlier. We developed a newer auto rack that was really centered around SUVs and could reduce damage, et cetera, that we thought was fairly innovative and was getting very good traction until automotive demand has dropped. So hopefully when it comes back, that will be the car type that we serve that market with. On the services side, again, we're trying to improve shippers' businesses by offering more tailored and innovative services, and that's really where the data comes in, making it more predictable, more reliable, able to, by being it doesn't necessarily have to be the fastest mode of transportation. It's important that it's predictable so that people can do their fleet planning, taking out the variability. Other modes of transportation may measure their accuracy in hours. We measure it in days. And so until we can close that gap, we're going to have a challenge as an industry. And then, trying to leverage some of the advancements that in other industries, like some of the trucking enhancements of GPS technology, trying to leverage some of those same tools in the rail space.
So you've already started answering my next question, actually, where, again, you've led the efforts within Trinity to adopt technology and analytics in managing the railcar business, particularly the leasing and management services side. How is that investment serving you in the current environment, particularly in terms of the overall resilience of the industry and the shippers that depend on it? And have you perhaps adopted new tracking technology or optimization capabilities during this time? Or possibly, are there any that you would like to implement going forward to help deal with these kinds of uncertain environments?
We're probably not moving as quick as we need to in that regard. So in terms of new technology or new services in the last couple of months, we haven't. We're really been focused on some of the things that we have with the GPS and different service levels, visibility with the data analytics that we've worked on, of trying to roll that out. That should, increasing that supply chain visibility is valuable in any part of the market, whether it's the down market or the up market. And so we think those should be kind of cycle resilient. We have to have the technology and the services there. Our shippers want that. Sometimes, they see the rail industry as kind of behind the times when compared to other modes of transportation, and we need to continue to close that gap. And I think a lot of the way we're going to do that, we talked about earlier, and with the innovation of products, but more so on the services side, and really making that rail supply chain as efficient and predictable as we can. It has a cost advantage, but it needs to be predictable in order to realize that cost savings.
So on a more positive note, several parts of the country, especially in the less dense urban centers, have started partial reopening of economic and recreational activity.
Mhm.
Have you started picking up any additional activity related to that? And what kind of scenario do you see unfolding in that regard?
Yeah, it's probably a little too early to tell the recovery in freight transportation, but the nice thing about freight transportation is we do get weekly measures on railcar loadings, and they're relatively real time. You'll get measures this week that'll tell you how we did last week.
Mhm.
So from an economic indicator, it has the frequency, and it's also real time enough that we do think it's a good indicator of how things are going. We're optimistic, if not hopeful, or maybe we're hopeful and optimistic that rail volumes will improve sometime in the third quarter. Like I mentioned earlier, they're down about 25% this quarter, and we expect that to kind of hold that kind of decline.
Mhm.
But regardless of the trajectory of the recovery, we believe we're well positioned to respond to the market. We know we're flexible and can be creative in providing long-term solutions to our customers.
So Eric, this has been very helpful and informative about how you're seeing things unfold at this stage. Do you have any final thoughts for us and for our audience?
I think we want to continue to evaluate our costs and organizational structure. The saying, don't waste a crisis. We're evaluating our business and figuring out how do we be more efficient? How do we also provide more solutions to grow? There may be opportunities to be more offensive in the industry, whether that's consolidation or new service offerings, acquisitions of other fleets. Those are all opportunities that we think we have the liquidity in the balance sheet to be able to execute on. It's sometimes in this environment, it's hard. It's hard to look for the growth when we're in the crisis mode. So, but we know from our history that there will be opportunities that come out of this, and it's about being able to respond when they do come to us. So that's about all I have.
Great. Well, Eric, thank you very much. Appreciate your time today, and wishing you all the best going forward. Thank you. So, John, you're Norfolk Southern's Vice President of Network Planning and Optimization. You're responsible for the railroad's operating plan. You've had a long career at Norfolk Southern where you've served in a variety of operating, administrative, commercial roles. You also serve as a board member on several short line railroads. And previously, you were chairman of Norfolk Southern's telecommunications subsidiary. So you've been around this industry and you've seen many ups and downs. Yet everyone tells us the current crisis is unprecedented. We've seen nothing quite like it. Now it's been nearly 2 months, I guess, since social distancing orders were put into place. And with it, social economic activities have dramatically changed. With your experience, what are you seeing about economic activity and rail freight movement, again, from your vantage point at this time? And how much of a contraction in activity are you experiencing or seeing relative, say, to the same time last year? And I've seen some numbers, floating around. Freight waves had some numbers recently, anywhere from 15, 20%, but in some lanes, some commodities, is much less. What are you seeing?
Well, when this started, we immediately started looking for an analogy in our history. Everybody looked back to 2009 and the Great Recession, but that was really a financial or banking crisis. This is very much an economic and a production consumption crisis. So I don't know whether to be happy or sad, but I've never seen anything like this before, and I hope I never will again. There has been contraction across really our entire base of customers. I might probably pick out the ones on one hand that are doing better, maybe some of the niche players in the chemical industry, maybe some of the folks who are supplying foodstuffs. I understand a lot of people are baking these days. On the other hand, there are some sectors of our customers who are just ceasing to ship. For example, I don't know if I could find a loaded multi-level full of automobiles on our railroad right now.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's overall freight is down substantially. I would say above 20% for all the class ones.
Mhm.
I hope we're at or near the trough with the automobile industry starting back up,
Mhm.
but it's really uncharted territory for all of us.
So again, as you've noted, contraction across the board, commerce, international trade dramatically impacted by COVID-19, though we hear some picking up, some of the shipments picking back up out of China because manufacturing there is picking up again. There's been health issues forcing plant closures or temporary shutdowns for extended cleaning in some instances. Also, there's been some possibly reprioritization of essential versus non-essential goods. That was more during the sort of the bulge that we had initially. Sort of looking at sort of within the network itself, what kind of impacts are you picking up in terms of different commodities, different markets, whether it's agricultural products, tankers, industrial parts, intermodal containers, and are you kind of reorganizing your rail network to recognize these changes and these patterns?
We were concerned initially about the need to prioritize essential shipments, for example, but really haven't had to do that. Okay. Right now, I think everybody is tearing up their supply chains and starting over again. And we're taking the opportunity to do the same. Basically, this is an opportunity to try things, to see what we can live without. Because in essence, think of this as a low-risk experimentation time. It's really trying to figure out what we can live without and rebuilding our network from there. The nice thing is that through this, we have maintained, in fact, substantially improved service levels. A lot of that's with volume going away, but it's also the fact that we've been able to take the opportunity to redesign our network.
So in terms of day-to-day operations, are you doing things differently because of health concerns for your employees, partners, and customers? And is that introducing perhaps more delays or unreliability?
No. Well, we have not introduced delays or unreliability, but we have changed the way we do business. Our underlying principle is that coming to work should be the safest thing that a person does that entire day. So we've changed a lot of processes. So for example, a lot of our job briefings where one crew turns over work to another crew are virtual. We've done the things that many other businesses have had to do, which is stepped up our industrial hygiene, our social distancing protocols, things like that. But if you think about it, we have a blue-collar workforce, an hourly workforce that is really scattered across our network in very small groups. So we're already pretty well situated to that. We have not had the pandemic affect our workforce availability. Frankly, that's something we're very concerned about, but that has proved to be unfounded. And I think that is in part due to the education that people have gotten, as well as some of the procedures we've put in place. The only places where I think we've had real need to manage things differently are in the New York City area, northern New Jersey, which is one of the places hit early. And we actually had to rent an entire hotel because we weren't comfortable with having our employees have contact with other people. So in essence, we had to create a bubble around our employees who were staying in that area. Chicago is another area, and I know that is a place that is, I think it had the most infections yesterday, the state of Illinois did. We haven't had manpower issues, but we have a lot of contractors in Chicago, and we have to make sure that we manage the contact they have. We had one person who turned out to unfortunately test positive, but that meant that 15 other people had to go into quarantine for a week.
Yep.
So that's a challenge, but with traffic being down, we've been able to manage very well, and it hasn't affected service.
Mm-hmm. So on a broader level, John, where do you see the most critical vulnerabilities in our existing supply chains? The sense that we've been getting is that there's been more concern about the nodes, rather than the links. So, warehouses maybe shutting down because of contamination concerns, terminals in some instances also temporarily shutting down, rather than, say, lack of capacity along links or disruptions along links. Has that been your experience? And again, in terms of some of these vulnerabilities at nodes, have these issues improved or worsened in the last few weeks?
I would definitely agree with the notion that nodes are more vulnerable, especially nodes in an urban area, because that can get your workforce very quickly. We have decided that our most vulnerable area is actually at our network operations center, where in essence we dispatch and provide customer support, crew management for the entire railroad. If we don't have those people, the railroad doesn't run. So we've been very aggressive in putting industrial hygiene protocols, social distancing, remote work in place to keep that running, and have been very successful about that. That's the thing we really are worried about. That said, the biggest impact on our network has not been pandemic vulnerabilities. It's been the dramatic drop in demand.
Yeah, indeed. John, how do you work with your customers in times like these? And how important is it to maintain communication channels open with your logistics partners? Is there perhaps more crisis-motivated collaboration that might be taking place, possibly even with competitors? And have you adopted any new methods of communication or tracking technology during this time?
Yeah, so I think it varies by customer, but I think we need to be more proactive and have been more proactive in reaching out to our customers. Everybody's business is changing. And if we don't reach out and understand what's going on and collect that kind of market intelligence, we're going to be caught short. At the same time, that's gotten more difficult because they're not in their offices any more than we're in our offices. So you have to establish new communication protocols. One of the things that we've done that's been very successful is we've put all our customer service folks to work at home. And frankly, that has been seamless. That's a new thing for us, having workers, especially agreement union workers, work from home. But our folks have stepped up and done a great job with that.
Is this something do you see potentially continuing past the pandemic?
Well, we're spending a lot of money building a new headquarters, and several people have asked whether that's going to be money well spent. I do think that this has given the people to have an involuntary trial run of new working methods. I'm not going to predict what those are, but I think our work environment is going to be much different going forward.
Yeah. So if somebody needs to take, to be away for some reason, that would not necessarily be the disruption it might have been in the past.
No, and it forces us to step up our technology and our communication game as well.
So, John, how is Norfolk Southern making your shippers' supply chains more resilient? And I know you've been involved in scheduling type activities at the railroad. To what extent have precision schedule railroading principles perhaps been a factor in maintaining services and on-time deliveries? And how has Norfolk Southern's use of other technology, particularly real-time tracking and analytics, contributed to these efforts?
Well, we started our PSR journey a little over a year ago. And I think it has, the biggest change for us is it's enabled us to adapt our network and really our cost structure much more quickly than we would have in the past.
Mm-hmm.
For example, when the auto manufacturers shut down, we were in essence able to remove the entire automotive network from our operating plan in just over a weekend, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, not disrupting service for our other shippers. And we're able to do that through the PSR blended model, where trains aren't just automotive trains, they handle many types of traffic. And we're building on that with the drops in traffic. It's giving us the opportunity to really try some more aggressive things. For example, we drops in volumes drove us to close our hump yard in North Carolina last week, and push that work out to smaller flat yards that we thought could do more efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been much more difficult if volumes were higher.
Yeah.
But frankly, now's the time to try it.
That's right.
One thing I heard is being inflexible or rigid at this time is really the only losing strategy in this.
Mm-hmm.
Those folks are the ones that are not going to succeed. You have to be willing to try things. So we're changing really quickly.
So on a perhaps more positive note, several parts of the country, especially in the less dense urban centers, have started partial reopening of economic activity, recreational activity, and so on. You've mentioned already the auto production starting up again. Have you started picking up any additional activity related to that, or is it still too soon, I guess? And what kind of scenario do you see unfolding in that regard?
Well, we are seeing some activity as people restart supply chains,
mm-hmm.
Especially on the automotive side. What we're finding is it's a very jagged curve.
Mm-hmm.
Things come up, they go down. There's production, but it may be limited because, frankly, people are trying to figure out how to run an industrial facility at this
mm-hmm.
time.
Yeah.
At the same time, we're also seeing permanent closures. There's guys who have held on, and now the crystal ball becomes ever so slightly clearer, and they realize, this isn't going to work for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can't give you a lot of brightness on the economic side.
Mm-hmm.
We were kind of hoping for the V-shaped recovery, then the U-shaped recovery, and now I guess we're at the L-shaped recovery.
Well, one of my previous speakers, Professor Yossi Sheffi from MIT,
mm-hmm.
characterized it as the whack-a-mole recovery, that there's all these problems that are going to be surfacing, and you're just going to be trying to sort of put out the fires one after the other. So I thought that was
a good analogy.
Yeah, good analogy. Anyway, so John, this has been extremely informative, and I very much appreciate your time. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
I guess the only thing is I was thinking about the rail industry in general. Mm-hmm. And, this is one of the times like this are the times that distinguishes the rail industry. First, from a financial perspective, because we're probably the only transport mode that doesn't run on pure cash flow.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me glad I'm with the railroad, but the railroad industry has the financial strength and balance sheets and asset structure to withstand and adapt to something like this over time. The other thing is that it proves how resilient the operating model is in a time like this, where frankly, most people wouldn't know that there's anything different with the trains that they're hauling their stuff.
That's right.
I guess the last thing I'd leave you with is I'm really glad I'm not in the passenger rail business these days.
Indeed. Well, John, thank you very much again for your time, and I'd like to wish you and your company all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So hello, everyone again. We move now to the live Q&A portion of our roundtable. Several of our speakers are with us, not quite yet, though. It's going to take a few minutes to have them join. So I believe Dave Arganbright is going to be with us via audio only. So we will not see he won't have a camera on, but maybe joining by phone. Eric Marchetto from Trinity was unable to make the Q&A, but he was kind enough to recommend that his colleague, Dan Anderson, who is VP for Customer Strategy, will be here to take a few questions. Dan, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate you're making yourself available for this. And John Friedman from Norfolk Southern is also with us. He is, logging on as we speak. So we will have representatives from all three companies. We also have with us Brett Johnson, who is Senior Associate Director of our Transportation Center at Northwestern. And Brett is moderating the Q&A line. Essentially, he's been receiving all the questions, and then we'll be directing them to our speakers. But before Brett does that, I do wanted to turn to Dave and ask him a few questions. Dave, are you there?
I'm here, honey.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So Dave, you and I spoke what seems like ages ago. It was in mid-April. And with our other two speakers, we kind of spoke in the last week. So perhaps the information is a little more current. And I've had a chance to ask them questions that I was not able to ask you then, because as we all noted, things have been very dynamic during this crisis, and things have been changing, rather rapidly. And so, Dave, I'd like to so at the time you and I spoke, there was clearly a time lag in the way that in what you were experiencing, in the sense that rail had not quite yet fully experienced, I think, what the drop in demand that both of our speakers have referred to, both of our other speakers have referred to. And also, last week we talked to our friends in the trucking industry, and clearly they were experiencing an overall drop in demand, though, as you all noted, it kind of varies by sector. Some sectors are still doing really well, and in fact, there's been a significant increase in demand for some product categories, but overall, there's that big drop, that big drag. And so, Dave, my question to you, first of all, is, you do provide, again, that first and last mile sort of connection. And how have things changed since the time you and I spoke about a month ago?
I'd say my answer probably mirrors John's much more topical comments. Our overall business is down now about 25%. It pretty much follows the other class ones. We are primarily a BNSF short line, so we're more subject to the things that affect them. We are a little overweight in the oil and gas sector, and had a very large presence in the Illinois Valley sand market. We've seen that off about 40%, and we're not sure it will ever recover. None of us expected a Saudi Arabian oil war and a complete cessation of demand. So, COVID or not, that sector may be down and out for the count.
Okay, so Dave, also you had mentioned at the time, various areas, you'd mentioned the paper products and so on, where you were experiencing, quite a bit of a surge in demand, but also mentioned that, you kind of went through various sectors and talked about auto components, for instance, where you were looking at how that might be moving as possibly a leading indicator for where things might be going. Could you comment a little further on these aspects?
Sure. John was kind of talking about the back end of automotive production and the multi-level fleet. We see more on the front end of production, scrap steel for the mini mills, that type of thing. We've watched that business demand dry up as the assembly plants have slowed down or stopped. I think when we see that pick back up, that will be a good leading indicator that sector of the economy is coming back. We are indeed still seeing strength in our Granger products. Certainly grains are still moving to market. There's a demand for them. And John and I both serve several plants for Georgia Pacific and others that are making everything from toilet paper to napkins to other things that are in high demand. And we're still seeing quite a healthy volume there.
Okay, thank you, Dave. At this time, I'd like, sorry, somebody wanted to add to that? So at this time, I will turn it over to Brett Johnson with the first question from the Q&A session. And if they have identified themselves, please tell us the name as well.
Thanks, Hadi. The first question is, the person did not identify themselves, but I want to, Dan, thanks for joining on behalf of Trinity today. The first question I want to ask was directed towards Eric. So let me throw it at you and see if we can take care of it. The question asks, he says, Eric mentioned that Class 1s can gain share by improving shipment visibility. How should the industry do this? Is Trinity doing anything around this, such as putting technology on its own rail cars?
Oh, happy to take that, Brett, and appreciate being here and the time to talk with you all. So one of the unique things about rail relative to some of the other modes is that only about 20% of the rail cars in the 1.7 million rail car fleet in North America are owned by the railroads. About 70% are either leased to shippers or owned directly by shippers, which gives shippers a unique opportunity to interact and control how those cars are outfitted. And what we can do is use that rail car instead of as a dot on a map, as an actual hub for information about the cargo and about the rail car during shipment. We've been looking at, as Eric mentioned, we've been looking at how we outfit cars with sensors and how we integrate some of the analytics we already have coming from the shipments and give shippers a better insight into what's happening to their car, but more importantly, what's happening to their cargo in transit. And that's how we can work collectively as an industry to improve that visibility and allow supply chains to be much more reactive and nimble in times like these, as well as normal times.
Thanks, Dan. John, I want to direct a couple questions to you. I'm going to try to put two together. And one was a general question, and then the other one was from an anonymous asker. So Krishnan Viswanthan asks, and I'm going to follow this up with the second question because they're related. Given the drastic decrease in fuel prices, has there been a notable shift in goods being shipped by truck instead of rail? And then the question that's related to that was directed to you is, how can railroads attempt to grow and convert traffic from truck? As Eric from Trinity said during his interview, is service and supply chain visibility part of the solution?
Okay, so first of all, I think we've seen the primary pressure from fuel prices come in the intermodal sector. It's that's the area where guys can flip back and forth most easily, and frankly, a lot of that is price sensitivity. It seems like there's a lot of gyration. Frankly, the other area where we've seen it is the accelerating decline of coal. which is driven not only by really cheap natural gas, but by, frankly, really low electrical loads, which in essence means fewer power plants are running and sitting on bigger coal stockpiles. As to the way we bring traffic to the rails from truck, I think, first of all, one of the few side benefits of this pandemic is that railroad service is probably as good as it's been in a really long time. And I'm not just talking for my railroad, but for other railroads. If you look at both our customer facing and our internal metrics, the lack of volume, as well as the opportunity to capitalize on some of the PSR gains, has enabled us to run fast and consistently. So there's a good chance to demonstrate the value of the product. The second piece of that is that in an environment like this, everybody's looking for an opportunity to take costs out of supply chains. And if we can demonstrate that, and at the same time give people the data they're expecting in terms of visibility or predictive analytics, I think we have an opportunity to take share.
Thank you. Could we take maybe perhaps Dave's take on this, because obviously the short lines are directly in some ways might be in closer competition with trucks for some of these short moves. Dave, any comment from your side?
Well, I think it varies with specifics. I mean, we are vulnerable to drastic changes in the underlying modal cost structure, and we haven't really seen that yet. The interesting thing about this pandemic is a number of forward-looking initiatives with our major customers are continuing as if nothing has changed. Multi-million-dollar investments, capital improvements. People are banking on a bright future, and we're still acting as if that future is coming.
Thank you. Eric, is this something you care to add to?
And
It's okay. I'll take the
Sorry,
compliment.
Dan, apologize.
I'll take the compliment. It's fine. Absolutely. I think Rail's starting from a very strong position. Rail is a great mode in three key ways. First, it relies on a privately funded infrastructure. So the railroads are leading the way, paying for the track, paying to maintain it, which makes it much more dependent on the market forces as opposed to government funding ebbs and flows. Second, it's very sustainable. So if we were just to move 10% of the freight that moves on trucks today over to rail, we could save billions of gallons of 1.6 billion gallons of fuel every year. And the last is it's the envy of the world. It bestows on manufacturers and producers in North America a unique competitive advantage. China is working tirelessly in South America to make those freight rail networks more robust to get grain to market, because of although they have so many cost advantages when it comes to producing soybeans and corn, it's still hard to get those to port to get them to China, which is the key hindrance there and something that North America leads the way on. So rail starts from a great position, and it's all about giving better visibility and making it more user-friendly for the shipper.
Thank you, Dan. Brett, you want to move to the next question?
yeah, Krishnan asked a question that picks up on some of the things John said in his interview. And so I'd like to go to John first, but ask each of the panelists to address this question, which is, what business processes did you have in the past that the pandemic has revealed to be pointless or inefficient and that you can live without?
Well, I mean, the basic one is that having everybody show up to work every day. I think I talked about this in my remarks, but the fact that we can successfully manage things with people being at home, frankly, is changing some of our processes, and frankly will help us, I think, better attract people, especially if we live in an area where 1 to 2 hour commutes is routine. There are a lot of operating barriers that we're breaking through in terms of our chief operating officer talked about looking at what we're doing, especially some of our assets and terminals, and testing what we can live without. And frankly, we're finding a lot of stuff we can live without.
Dan, how about at Trinity? What have you learned?
Oh, I'm going to echo what John said. Definitely that you don't need everyone to show up in the corporate office every day in order to keep the wheels turning. You know, our transition over to working remotely has been, we haven't missed a beat. And I think customers would echo that as well. And figuring out how to do this remotely. It's also, you know, we tend to focus on the longer term with our customers. And because of the nature of the service we offer, it's a 40 to 50 year lived asset. So we're considering decades worth of futures when we're considering purchasing or leasing a rail car. And you know, one thing that we have learned is that without all the meetings running between meetings at corporate offices every day, we have more time to talk about long-term solutions with our customers. And that's one you know, thing that I didn't anticipate. I expected everyone to be busy and hard to get meetings, but our sales team has been relaying that you know, our customers, we're having great conversations. There is a great deal of optimism about what the future holds when you're talking a long-term capital investment.
Dave, do you have anything to add to this discussion?
Yeah, first, I mean, I would echo the other two speakers. You know, our headquarters in Denver has been vacant for 2 months, and frankly, we're not quite sure how we're going to reintegrate the building and what that actually means. But I think in terms of opportunity, you know, the railroad industry, even though you wouldn't know it, has long been an early adopter of technology. And this has given us an opportunity to review some of the things that technology may really be able to do for us that we took for granted in the past. For example, you know, we have a system where we know that the health and location and movement of all of our locomotives and therefore all of our trains in our system. Our road foreman could theoretically gauge the performance of their engineers without even being in the cab with them. And we can still communicate with our customers directly and efficiently without being trackside. So I think we'll continue to see how we can use technology to manage in a world where we're not all in the same office building.
So if I could follow up on that question, our friends in the trucking industry, basically, I mean, all of them echoed the notion that who knew we didn't need all that paper, kind of going to pretty much paperless, touchless transactions in terms of, you know, of handoff and picking up loads, delivering them, et cetera. Has that been an issue also for railroads, or it's not been the case?
It's been a place where we've changed transactions, especially actually for especially as we deal with truckers on the interface. Mm-hmm. Frankly, you know, truckers don't want paper. They don't want to be talking to people or talking even in call boxes. So we've gone as touchless as we can, and it's also helped speed adoption of some of our intermodal apps. That lets truckers interact with us via the app instead of actually having to talk to somebody.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, Brett, you want to move with our next question?
Yeah, I have another question for everyone from Dr. Majid Al-Gandour, who asks, how do you validate your analytics models during COVID for both, you know, rail freight and supply chain operations, since now you may not have any good historical events or data to use? Or that perhaps what we should say is that maybe the historical data is relevant at this point. How are you operating your analytics tools that you're using?
I'm not sure I really understand the question in terms of the models changing or just reduced volumes.
Oh, I think it comes down to using analytics to help you with your operations. And if you're using historical data to help drive decisions, how are you operating now that you're working in a new, you know, kind of in a new era? Are those analytical models or tools for network optimization or whatever, or precision scheduled railroading? How are you working in today's environment?
I guess I would say it's referring possibly to calibrating demand models or the demand assumptions you might be making.
Yeah, I'll step in here and just say from a Trinity perspective, you know, we've struggled with this honestly over the last few weeks and months as this has happened. There is no good historical in the aggregate, and that's where we take a belief that there is no such thing as a rail car market. There are markets for rail cars. So what we've done is we've tried to break the industry down into more digestible segments and look at the historical, and isolate those markets that may not have a historical corollary, like coal, for example, that's been on a structural decline for a long time, and the models haven't been working in coal for some time now. But ethanol, despite all the headwinds on the fuel side, it still has a tight correlation with ethanol production, which is, the production models there are still pretty relevant today. So that's how we've dealt with it, is tried to reconstruct the models and go to the core and isolate those that may be the problem when you're trying to look at the aggregate, and focus on those that we do have good corollaries with.
That's a really good strategy, actually, to go sector by sector, essentially, and assess whether there's been this major discontinuity where you need to think with different kinds of information than simply the historical data, and others where the historical data may still be a pretty good predictor of what you may still be seeing. It's a very good approach. John, does that affect your operation much at all?
So there's two pieces. First, on the operating models, the nice thing is physics hasn't changed. So I think all those are pretty solid. Mm-hmm. On the demand forecasting side, the models are basically shot. If nothing else, our customers don't know what their business is going to look like. And remember, we're mostly kind of a derived demand industry here. The good news is we are sitting on huge amounts of unused capacity. So in essence, we are over buffering things.
Dave, any thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say this. John alluded to it previously. One of the reasons that the rail industry has been so resilient and has been able to get through so many economic disasters over the years is we have an outstandingly good ability as an industry to match our cost structure with changes in our revenue structure. And, that has allowed us to get through some tough times. Having said that, from the short line perspective, as the letter carrier or the hunter-gatherer, we still have to perform the same level of activity, whether, we're going to get 5 cars or 50. So we don't have the same elasticity models in what we're trying to do. It's more around serving the needs of the customer than it is sizing the network for the volume.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Brett, another good question.
Yeah, I have a question for John that picks up on his interview. Anonymous question here. John, you referred during your interview, this is an opportunity for low risk experimentation. Can you give any examples of what Norfolk Southern is doing or experimenting with right now?
Sure. In my own department, we've decided to merge some staffs to try and get better linkage between the folks that do network optimization and the folks that deal with the field. So we're trying new organizational structures, even as people aren't in the office. We have reorganized a lot of our mechanical processes to the point where we've been able to figure out that we can do without a major locomotive shop, and we've also figured out that now was the time to really beef up some of our yard activities in the Piedmont area of North Carolina for efficiency, while at the same time closing a hump yard. So it's a little bit of back to the future, but it's a great time to experiment because if stuff doesn't work, it's much lower risk.
Dave, are you doing any experimentation at OmniTRAX?
I think, in our sector of the industry, we're already fairly decentralized, very lean, very empowered. And so we'd like to think we have the ability to turn the ship, if it were, on a faster keel than an aircraft carrier. But it also highlights where there are weaknesses in that chain. And where we've seen things fall down, it's an opportunity to correct them in the here and now. And so that's been beneficial to us.
Okay, any more questions, Brett?
Dan, anything to add to that question?
I would just say that we launched our customer digital channel earlier this year, which is a way for us to allow our lessees, people that are leasing our rail cars, anywhere, anytime access to key information and services about their car. And we had no idea that this was going to be a great time to experiment with such a remote-based solution for people to manage their rail car fleets. So while that experiment wasn't initiated during COVID, it's a great time to test its resiliency when everyone's working remotely.
Great, thank you. We have two questions related to capital expenditures. One's directed to John, and I'll ask the other one, which is a little bit more generic for everybody. Sheldon Harrison asks, John, are you likely to delay key capital investments in track infrastructure if the situation stretches out for an extended period? And the follow-on to that, again, from an anonymous participant is, should railroad customers and channel partners be concerned about large reductions in capital expenditures? And could this potentially impact capacity or service in the future?
Well, I'll take the second one first. The one nice thing about railroads is that they are very good at absorbing year-to-year fluctuations in capital, simply because the assets are so long-lived. Usually you can do something the next year and catch up. We tend to have a bigger capital budget than most railroads. We tend to run at a higher percentage of revenue. We, I think, have announced some reductions in that capital budget, but I would not be worried about a reduction in capacity, both specifically at Norfolk Southern and generally in the U.S. Class 1 railroad network, because so many railroads are sitting on so much excess capacity.
John or Dave, would you like to, Dan or Dave, would you like to address that question?
No, I'll take a stab at it real quick. The interesting, that question may have been framed from knowledge of the U.S. rail industry in the 1970s when, as their fortunes declined before deregulation, the Class 1 railroads and others deferred maintenance for literally decades at a time, where they were within a whisper of not being able to provide service at all. In today's environment, where a state of good repair is generally a standard, I would agree with John that if we need to adjust capital plans year by year, we're not really altering the underlying fundamental structure of our assets, and we can absorb that. Now, having said that, because there is such uncertainty in the market right now, we are conserving our capital as much as possible within our own company, just to make sure we have some powder left if we do need to make some expenditures.
I do have one thing to add for that. It kind of ties in a little bit with David, but the one big piece of irony is that our engineering forces are showing unprecedented amount of productivity. They are setting weekly records simply because there are no trains in the way. So I'm afraid we're going to run out of money before they run out of weather.
Interesting.
Here's another question.
Dan, did you have anything to add to that general point?
Our capital investments are similar to the railroads, not as long-lived, but multi-year projects. We've got a new maintenance facility that Eric mentioned going on in Iowa right now. We've been adding coding capabilities at some of our facilities to match the market footprint. And just like David mentioned, we're trying to right-size our current spend for the world. But as any good modeler knows, when uncertainty is as prevalent as it is, scenario planning takes the place of a baseline modeling. So scenario planning has become the name of the game for us. We have two scenarios that we revealed to the street in our last earnings call that we're using to watch the indicators, see which way it heads, and then base our capital off of which of the scenarios seems most likely as we learn more about how this is going to progress.
Thank you. Brett?
Preface this next question by repeating that we may be in a whack-a-mole economic situation and recovery, but a question was asked, what challenges could railroads, and I'll add railcar fleet managers, face when capacity increases as the economy begins to open up and volumes rise? So what kind of issues do you foresee facing, if any? We can start with John.
Yeah, I'm not really worried about capacity per se. What concerns me is shifts in supply chains. Guys start sourcing stuff from different places. And that's one thing, because of the nature of our fixed infrastructure, we're kind of slow to respond to. So it's a combination of supply chain shifts as well as variability.
Like, go around with that.
To address that question?
Well, I'll just add that there was a point, I believe, in 2006, before the housing crisis occurred, where the U.S. rail industry was notionally at capacity. And when we began to see that, the discussions that railroads have in that environment are talking about things like double or triple tracking, talking about signaling to increase density. We don't know what the net effect of positive train control will be on the movement of goods. I think in the initial phases, the networks will actually slow down a little as we're adapting to the technology. But I'm hoping that PTC 2.0 and 3.0 can allow us to create even more throughput through the infrastructure that we have.
Thank you.
On the rolling stock side of the business, we've seen a significant increase in the number of rail cars that are in storage presently since the beginning of March. That's increased by about 25,000 cars, which is quite significant. It's almost 420,000 at this point. So the rail car fleet remains ready, and the only thing that we will have to watch is the availability of storage in the meantime for these assets as they wait for the economy to recover.
Okay, thank you. Brad, do we have more?
Yeah, I have another one. I'm going to go back to John with Michael Manns asks, as the economy wraps up, will railroads be able to onboard employees fast enough? And this presumes that you have some employees furloughed or laid off. And, are you going to run the risk of some efficiencies in your business getting back, getting those new employees re-engaged?
It's a very good question. Speaking mostly about our train and engine service employees, because those are some of the longest lived ones. I think a lot of the railroads have taken proactive efforts to try and put employees on reserve boards or things like that to retain people, even though they're furloughed, preserving some minimum level of income, railroad service credits, benefits, things like that. Maintaining those and having the discipline to do that, especially if this pandemic and the associated recession or depression lasts a while, is going to be really critical to preserving that resilience.
Dave, would you like to tackle this one too?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for our segment of the industry, we're still a small business, and our employment is not subject to the volatility of traffic like it is with the Class 1s. Another interesting fact is during this crisis, our ownership and management has made the very public statement that their employees come first even before the business. So what that translates to is the fact that we have not furloughed or laid off anyone within the OmniTRAX family as of this date. And so when things start to begin to get back to normal, we'll still have the assets in place to deliver to our Class 1s when they need it.
Thank you. Dan?
Our industry, the manufacturing side, has a history of ups and downs and moving with the market as necessary. So we're well apt to respond as things become necessary. We have about 130,000 rail cars in our lease fleet, and only about 17% of those are up for renewal this year. So a lot of there's a fairly steady business on the leasing side of the house. It's manufacturing that stands ready to respond and has experience doing it.
Thank you. Brett, do you have any more questions? Or?
Yeah, I have a trucking industry question that's related to rail. So you may not choose to answer this entire question, but we're all aware there's been a temporary waiver of certain truck weight regulations and hours of service regulations as well. Do you think that these changes are here for good, or they're going to revert back to pre-pandemic status? That's the one you may not answer. But in the meantime, is this affecting your competitiveness with the trucking industry right now, or are you seeing any implications of this? I think this was just enacted last week, so I would be surprised if it's trickled down.
I'll just address one thing, which is our Washington representatives are scared to death that that this is gonna get slipped in a bill someplace and pass through unnoticed because of, frankly, the volume of relief measures that Washington is dealing with. So it may be, I'm not saying unintended, but it may be done under cover of darkness.
Dave, you handle, I guess, government relations as well.
Yeah, I know more about this than I ever wanted to. You know, I think when you take the politics out of this, truck size and weight is itself a symptom of a different issue, which is when you change the underlying economics of one mode versus another in the transport sector, then you can change the balance of competition, you know, not driven simply by carriers competing with each other. And so our fear, as the lowest lying fruit, is that if it is all of a sudden much cheaper per bushel for a farmer to send his product via truck versus a hopper car, then yes, we're in danger of losing that traffic, and that does concern us.
Thank you. Ben, any comment on that?
I would just say that this is an important point to emphasize the difference in the infrastructure makeup, that freight railroads in North America rely on private investment and responding to market forces and take care of their own assets relative to, you know, the trucking industry relying on public roads and infrastructure. And, you know, you just need to consider the long-term ramifications of heavier trucks on that infrastructure.
Yep, that's a discussion that we've all had in the past, and I think we'll probably continue. It's an important point. Thank you. Brett?
I have a question from Frank that I want to tweak a little bit and stay with Dan. And I want to ask Dan, as a customer of rail, have you seen, what are the differences you've seen in on-time train performance now versus pre-COVID? And then we can ask the railroads to answer that as well.
I'll point to train speeds as a great metric to use to really quantify that. And train speeds have really improved dramatically in the last few weeks. It's a weekly measure that you can find easily on the Surface Transportation Board website. And we track it fairly regularly to look at network fluidity, which obviously impacts how many turns a rail car can have in any given period of time. You know, we've seen the moving average, the 4-week moving average increase 4 or 5%. And so network fluidity is definitely up. Speeds are up, dwell times are down, and that just helps the responsiveness.
Thanks.
Hadi, there are several more. There's one more, though, that I think is, that I'd like to steer towards John, which is, John, there's a question that asks about, has the ability to generate continuous real-time information on train location and speed enabled you to generate new business benefits and improve a service to your customers? Or is that information primarily used by PT systems for generating safety benefits only?
Yeah, so I think the question refers to the data being generated by the PTC system.
Yes.
And I think our primary focus right now is getting this thing to work. Remember that, PTC is rolled out pretty much everywhere it's supposed to be. All territories, not all trains are running it. And so the extent we are trying to manage that system and manage that data, we are really focused on our end of the year deadlines towards getting stuff to work and getting federal sign off. I think once we do that, then we can start leveraging it.
Brett, I know at the beginning there was a question that I think was directed at Dave that Maya had asked. Could you?
Sure. Yes. Actually, I just found this one as we were listening to the last question. Wasn't directed to anybody in particular, but it's from Maya Tataneni, and she wanted to know how much of the impact or drop in demand that you're experiencing right now is due to COVID-19 situations, and how much may be due to other circumstances. Is it possible to separate and understand the difference?
We're gonna start with I guess with Dave, because it was asked during his interview.
Okay.
And then we'll go around.
Yeah, I think I already alluded to the fact that the cheap price of fuel, in some respects, had nothing to do with COVID. That externality was occurring before this happened. Now, the problem was then exacerbated by the complete lack of demand for fuel with no one traveling during COVID. But I think, the answer to the question is, as economic activity decreases by some percentage amount, then obviously demand for raw material and finished products correlates to diminish by similar amounts, with the exception of things that are in higher demand, during, the things that keep people fed and sheltered are obviously going to always be the most important. And so, the foodstuffs and the basic amenities, they're recession proof, right? They will continue to be needed. And the luxury goods and items, things like finished vehicles, those will have to wait for the recovery.
So Dan, this ties in a little bit with what you'd mentioned earlier about sort of segmenting the different sectors. Want to try to also maybe give us your opinion on this?
Yeah, so one of the things that we had to do when we were going ahead and segmenting the markets down was think about the structural versus the very temporal impacts that are happening today. And while a vast majority of what you're seeing is pretty much tied to COVID, there are certain segments of the rail industry that are facing structural headwinds. Coal is the most obvious that comes to mind, with the low price of natural gas now for some years. Now, granted, there's some debate about whether or not the low prices continue, and if coal makes some bit of a comeback, a minimal comeback in the coming years based upon lower production, but we'll leave that for another day and time. So yeah, there are certain segments. Crude oil is another one. Frac sand is another one that we're facing modal shares outside of the COVID situation as pipelines got built out in North America. Rail was, increasingly challenged in certain geographies to continue to be an economic means of moving crude oil to market. And frac sand was facing challenges from the in-basin sand threat, specifically in Texas, but in other areas as well. So there are limited places where you can spot structural decline that isn't helping as we face these headwinds.
Thank you. John, would you like to give us your take on this?
Yeah, it's tough to tell. First of all, what we found is a disproportionate amount of rail growth has come from somebody putting a hole in the ground. So the extent that people don't do that anymore or decide to do less of it, that's going to affect us most. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I really don't know the answer to is what the new economic order is going to look like. There's going to be a bunch of our customers that don't survive. And those are either direct or end user type customers. And then we're going to have a bunch of customers that we don't know yet. So we have to be able to transition and adapt.
Thank you. So Brett, do you have any sort of last burning questions? Because I want to ask a closing question. So if you have any really burning ones here you want to ask.
I don't have any burning ones I want to ask. So I want to go to you and let you ask your last question.
All right. So my question is this, and this is maybe kind of, again, looking ahead a little bit, as all, I guess every state now is doing some kind of partial opening to different degrees. Some are much more restrictive than others, but we're beginning to see this reopening take place. What I'd like to know is, as you start your day, leaving aside the stock price, if your company in the market, etc., what 2 or 3 indicators do you look at as you start your day to kind of assess where you are in this recovery curve, or things that you are kind of watching in terms of some of the decisions that you would be implementing given the plans and the scenarios that you have already worked on? And I'll start with John on this.
So there's one number I look at every day, and I look at our number of crew starts that we have every day, and I compare the change in that to the change in car loadings. And I look at a 7-day rolling average, and it's a good day if I have improved my number of crew starts year over year better than car loads. So my job is to make our railroad more volume variable. And right now I'm focused as the auto manufacturers come up by capturing as much of that volume as I can in our existing train network to try and get some leverage out of that.
Thank you. Dan?
For me personally, I can't speak to everybody at Trinity, but for me, the one metric I keep a very weathered eye on is the weekly fuel draw from inventories. Fuel is a great indicator of overall people getting back out, getting back to their commutes, and interacting closer to what normal would be. So I watch the net effect on production versus draws every week. ISM manufacturing has been a great indicator in terms of where industrial production is heading, just because the industrial production numbers lag so much. So those are the 2 that I personally track.
Out of curiosity, who releases the fuel draw information?
The Energy Information Agency has fuel inventories on a weekly basis.
Okay, thank you. So Dave, you get the final word here.
Again, as a small business, the number one metric that we're looking at every day right now is an affirmation and an assertion that every single one of our employees is safe and has not contracted the virus, or their spouses or relatives. And I think, as I mentioned, several weeks ago, due to the nature of railroading, many of our train and engine service employees, and I know John's and all the other class 1s as well, they're directly in the healthcare field. So they're at the front lines even more so than we are. And the fact that they have stayed healthy is very exciting to all of us. I think, I want to end by echoing one of the things that John said earlier, which is I am extremely proud of our industry and having been a part of it for 35 years. We have an amazing resiliency. We have an amazing ability to survive. And so as a result of that, I don't have to focus on the tactical. I have the luxury of being able to wonder what tomorrow is going to look like and what I can do to set the table for the opportunities that are going to come down the road.
Great. Well, on this positive note, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. We appreciate the candor that you have displayed here, and the wealth of information that you have shared with us and with our audience. So thank you very much for everything you're doing, and to your companies for keeping the goods flowing for us. To our audience, thank you for joining us again this week. We thought this might be the last of our asynchronous virtual roundtables, but we have a bonus AVR next week. This will be AVR number 9, and we're going to be dealing with e-commerce supply chain issues under COVID-19. So we look forward to your joining us again at the same time next week. So thank you all very much.